How does a nation that believed its army was the strongest in the world come to terms with total collapse? Not through years of grinding attrition, but through 6 weeks of lightning warfare that changed military doctrine forever. This is the story of how Blitzkrieg didn't just destroy an army, it shattered an entire national psyche in a matter of days. For the French soldiers and politicians who experienced May 1940, the transformation from absolute certainty in victory to complete surrender happened so fast it was incomprehensible. They had been prepared to fight another great war. They were prepared to fight a static battle of artillery and infantry, a defense of sacred soil from behind the greatest fortress ever built. Then came a weapon they couldn't comprehend, warfare moving at the speed of a tank, not the speed of a man walking. What happened in those 46 days wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collapse of everything the French people had been told about their military superiority, their brilliant generals, and their nation's inevitable triumph. The Blitzkrieg didn't just end a battle, it ended an entire way of understanding war. To understand the shock, you must first understand what the French believed in May 1940. Despite the phony war, the French army was considered the most powerful in the world. It had more tanks and better tanks than the Germans. It had the heroic legacy of Verdun. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a worldview built on the victory of 1918. The Poilu had broken the Kaiser's army. French military doctrine, focused on methodical, controlled battle, bataille conduite, was seen as sophisticated and proven. They believed their spiritual elan and superior firepower would triumph. The entire nation was unified in this belief. They trusted their generals like Maurice Gamelin, the supreme commander. They trusted their technology. Most of all, they trusted the Maginot Line, a concrete and steel shield designed to make a German invasion of France physically impossible. The military had concrete plans for this final battle. The Dial Plan, the main variant of Plan D, called for the best French armies and the British Expeditionary Force to advance into Belgium. They would meet the main German attack there, fighting the battle on foreign soil. This plan assumed the main German thrust would come through central Belgium, just as it had in 1914. The Ardennes forest to the south was considered impassable for a modern armoured army. It was too dense, the roads too poor. It was a natural fortress that needed only light defences. Consider General André Corap, commander of the French Ninth Army, holding the Meuse River line just south of the main advance. His troops were mostly second-rate reservists. His sector was the hinge of the entire Allied plan, but it was considered a quiet, safe sector. Corap believed, as did the entire High Command, that any German attempt through the Ardennes would be a slow, grinding affair. The invaders would get stuck in the forest, giving the French ample time to move reserves and destroy them with artillery. These weren't fantasies, but careful calculations. The French had calculated the precise time it would take for infantry to march, for artillery to be emplaced. Their entire plan was based on a 1918 timetable. Every detail was considered, from railway schedules to horse-drawn artillery deployment. They had prepared for the last war. In this atmosphere of calm confidence, the first reports from May 10th seemed to confirm their plan. German paratroopers seized bridges in the Netherlands. The main German Army Group B attacked into Belgium. Gamelin gave the order. "The battle we have foreseen has begun," he declared. The best French mobile armies and the BEF pivoted into Belgium, racing to their prepared defensive lines. Everything was going exactly according to the Dial Plan. The trap was set. What the French High Command didn't know was that they were the ones walking into the trap. The real German plan, Vollgelb or Case Yellow, was radically different. The attack in Belgium was a feint, a massive distraction. The main attack, Army Group A, with 7 of Germany's 10 panzer divisions, was at that very moment driving through the impassable Ardennes forest. The French weren't completely ignorant of this. Their reconnaissance planes had spotted a massive traffic jam of German vehicles in the Ardennes. But the High Command simply could not process the information. They dismissed it. It had to be a secondary attack. No army could move panzers through that forest. This miscalculation would prove fatal. The Germans, led by generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, were not thinking in terms of 1918. They were practicing Blitzkrieg, a new doctrine based on combined arms, radio communication, and above all, shocking speed. The Germans didn't see the forest as an obstacle. They saw it as a shield. They raced down narrow logging roads, building pontoon bridges, and pushing forward 24 hours a day. Guderian's panzers covered 150 kilometers of impassable terrain in just 3 days, suffering almost no resistance. On the evening of May 12th, Guderian's lead elements reached the Meuse River at Sedan. They had done the impossible. They had emerged from the forest before the French even realized they were there. General Corrap's 9th Army, on the other side of the river, was completely unprepared. At Sedan, the reality defied all comprehension. Guderian didn't wait to build up artillery. On May 13th, he unleashed the Luftwaffe. Hundreds of Stuka dive bombers, the flying artillery of the Blitzkrieg, fell upon the French positions. The psychological effect was devastating. 20-year-old French reservist Corporal Pierre Dupont was in a concrete bunker on the Meuse. He had been told the bunkers were invincible. Then the Stukas came. The sirens, the Jericho trumpets, wailed. The bombs, while not bunker busters, shook the earth and shattered the morale of the defenders. Dupont witnessed his comrades abandon their posts. Men who had been prepared to fight to the death were broken in hours. They were not cowards. They were soldiers, trained for a 1918 battle, suddenly thrust into a 1940 nightmare of sound, terror, and relentless, pinpoint bombing. This wasn't warfare as they understood it. It was like the sky itself was tearing apart. The Stukas targeted command posts, cutting communication lines. They targeted artillery batteries, silencing the French guns. It was a systematic, psychological dismantling of the entire defense before the ground attack even began. The testimonies of other survivors painted an equally incomprehensible picture. French gunners reported being unable to fire as Stukas attacked them the moment they revealed their position. Infantry in open trenches were buried alive or driven mad by the constant screaming bombardment. Under this aerial umbrella, German combat engineers in rubber assault boats crossed the Meuse in broad daylight. They faced machine gun fire, but the French defense was already collapsing. The bunkers, designed for frontal assault, were being outflanked. The psychological shock was complete. Once across, the engineers established a bridgehead. By that night, the first pontoon bridges were being built. Guderian, in a panic that his superiors would order him to stop, pushed his panzers across the river. The impenetrable Meuse line, defended by the impassable Ardennes, had fallen in one day. The French High Command simply could not believe the reports. When General Gamelin was told panzers were across the Meuse at Sedan, he refused to accept it. "That is impossible," he stated. "It must be a patrol." He believed his doctrines, not the reality from the front. General Corrap's 9th Army didn't just bend, it shattered. The reservists, their morale broken by the Stukas and their lines pierced by panzers, simply dissolved. They dropped their rifles, abandoned their artillery, and began a mass panicked retreat. The hinge of the Allied line had broken. The psychological impact rippled outward from Sedan. Civilians who had been told the war would be fought in Belgium suddenly saw German tanks racing through their villages. A massive flood of refugees, millions of them, poured onto the roads, clogging them completely. This river of refugees was a key part of the German plan. They clogged the roads, preventing French and British reinforcements from moving forward. Panzers and refugees now shared the same roads, a surreal nightmare of civilian panic mixed with the lightning-fast advance of the enemy. On May 14th, the bulge at Sedan became a breakout. Guderian, against direct orders to consolidate, turned his panzers west. He began the sickle cut, Sichelschnitt, a high-speed dash towards the English Channel. This move was so audacious even the German High Command thought it was insane. But Guderian and Rommel understood the new rules of war. They were not fighting an army, they were fighting a mindset. The French were still thinking in days and weeks. The Germans were thinking in hours and minutes. The French command loop was hopelessly slow, based on telephone lines and paper reports. The Germans were using radio. Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, led from the front. He was often cut off from his own command, but he kept pushing. He used the radio to coordinate his tanks, his Stukas and his infantry in real time, creating a tempo of war the French could not match. French tank commanders, by contrast, often had to dismount to receive orders. Their tanks, like the Somme S-35 and Char B-1 bis, were individually superior to the German Panzer III and I-4. But they were deployed in small penny packets, designed to support infantry, not as independent armored divisions. The French doctrine was to use tanks as a shield. The German doctrine was to use them as a sword. At Sedan, the sword had just punched through the shield. The French now had powerful tank forces, but they were all in the wrong place, racing north into Belgium. The breakout created a 50-kilometer wide gap in the Allied line. Into this gap poured the Wehrmacht. The French Ninth Army had ceased to exist. The French Second Army, to its south, was in chaos. There was nothing between Guderian's panzers and the English Channel. In Paris, the government finally realized the scale of the disaster. On May 15th, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud made a frantic, panicked phone call to Winston Churchill. "We have been defeated," he said. "We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill, stunned, replied, "It cannot have happened so soon." Reynaud insisted, "The front is broken near Sedan. They are pouring through." The psychological collapse at the very top was complete. The belief in the world's greatest army had evaporated in just 72 hours. Gamelin, the supreme commander, was a ghost. He issued orders to recapture Sedan, but he had no reserves to do so. His best armies were still in Belgium, now in danger of being cut off. He had been completely intellectually outmaneuvered. His entire career was based on a lie. On May 20th, just 7 days after crossing the Meuse, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Division reached Abbeville on the English Channel. The sickle cut was complete. The best French armies and the entire British Expeditionary Force were now trapped in a pocket, their backs to the sea. This single 200-mile dash had decided the campaign. It was the most stunning operational victory in modern military history. It wasn't just a failure of arms, it was a failure of imagination. The French had prepared for every eventuality, except the one that actually happened. The psychological impact on the trapped soldiers in the pocket was profound. They were the elite of the Allied armies, and they had not even fought a major battle. They were now surrounded, cut off from supply, and being bombed relentlessly by the Luftwaffe as they retreated towards Dunkirk. 4S. The Maginot Line, the great $3 billion fortress, was now useless. It was a masterpiece of engineering, with air-conditioned barracks, underground railways, and massive gun turrets. But the Germans had simply driven around it. It was a monument to a failed idea, a symbol of France's psychological paralysis. The soldiers manning the line were now irrelevant. They sat in their impregnable fortresses, listening on the radio as their country was conquered hundreds of miles away. It was the ultimate humiliation. The shield was perfect, but the enemy had simply attacked where the shield was not. In the French government, panic and denial reigned. Gamelin was fired on May 19th and replaced by the 73-year-old General Maxime Weygand. Weygand was a hero of 1918, but he was equally unequipped to understand blitzkrieg. He spent days trying to grasp the situation. Weygand proposed a counterattack to cut the German corridor, but the French army was in chaos. Communications were gone. Units were disorganized. The refugee-clogged roads made movement impossible. The army had become a broken machine, as one officer described it. Meanwhile, in Belgium, King Leopold III surrendered his army, exposing the northern flank of the Dunkirk pocket. The British, realizing the battle for France was lost, made the decision to save their own army. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, began. For the French, this was the ultimate betrayal. Their ally was abandoning them. But the British saw it as the only logical choice: save their army to fight another day. The miracle of Dunkirk, where 338,000 Allied soldiers were rescued, was also the final seal on the defeat of France. The German case red, Vollrot, the second phase of the invasion, began on June 5th. The panzers, rested and refitted, now turned south to destroy the remaining French armies. The French, depleted and demoralized, tried to form a hedgehog defense, but it was hopeless. The panzers shattered the new French line on the Somme and Aisne rivers. The government declared Paris an open city and fled south, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. The chain of command had completely dissolved. France was no longer a state, It was a collection of defeated, fleeing individuals. Soldiers who survived the Sedan breakthrough couldn't process what had happened. They had been told their tanks were better, their guns were better, their spirit was stronger. They had been defeated by an idea. They had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and outpaced. The psychological shock was so complete that many Frenchmen, like the future resistance hero Marc Bloch, began to write about the strange defeat, l'étrange défaite. It was a defeat of the mind, a sickness in the high command, a failure of leadership that had doomed the nation. Bloch, a medieval historian serving as a staff officer, watched in horror as the army disintegrated. He saw staff officers who refused to believe reports from the front. He saw a reliance on paper and telephones in an age of radio. He saw a geriatric command structure obsessed with the last war. The Germans hadn't just defeated France, they had invalidated its entire military identity. The Poilu, the hero of Verdun, was now a refugee on the road. The Elan that was supposed to conquer all was powerless against Stukas and Panzers. The nation's spirit was broken. This psychological collapse explains the speed of the surrender. On June 16th, Prime Minister Reynaud resigned. He was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun. Pétain's first act was to ask the Germans for an armistice. He believed further resistance was suicide. Pétain's reasoning was that the army was destroyed and that only surrender could save the civilian population from total annihilation. He chose to make a gift of his person to France, a decision that would lead to the collaborationist Vichy regime and his own trial for treason. For the soldiers and civilians, this was the final shock. The man who symbolized the victory of 1918 was now telling them to lay down their arms. The world had turned upside down. Everything they believed about their country, their army, and their heroes had been proven false in 6 weeks. The Germans hadn't needed to invade. They simply drove around the fortress, shattered the field army, and waited for the psychological collapse to do the rest. This was the true horror of blitzkrieg that struck the French. It was a weapon that targeted the enemy's mind. The armistice was signed on June 22, 1940. Hitler, in a calculated act of humiliation, forced the French to sign in the same railway carriage, in the same forest of Compiègne, where Germany had surrendered in 1918. He was not just defeating France, he was rewriting history. For the French people, the speed of this reversal was dizzying. Just 6 weeks prior, they were citizens of a global empire, protected by the world's greatest army. Now, they were a defeated, occupied nation, listening to German military bands marching down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. The psychological impact on the French soldiers, who were now prisoners of war, was profound. Over 1.8 million men were captured. They had been trained to believe in their superiority, only to be rounded up in days, often without firing a shot. Their faith in their leaders was obliterated. Many French veterans in post-war interviews described a feeling of profound shame and confusion. They had not been beaten by better soldiers. They had been beaten by a better idea. Their generals had sent them to fight a 20th century war with a 19th century mindset. Intelligence officers interrogating captured French generals noted their total inability to comprehend what had happened. They spoke of bad luck or German tricks. They simply could not accept that their entire intellectual framework for modern warfare was wrong. They were intellectually bankrupt. The French Char B-1 bis tank, so feared by German tankers, was a prime example. It was a 31-ton monster with thick armor and 2 guns. But it was slow, consumed enormous amounts of fuel, and was operated by a tragically overworked commander who had to aim the main gun. This design philosophy was a direct result of 1918 thinking. The tank was a mobile bunker designed to support infantry. The German Panzer III, by contrast, was a 20-ton vehicle with a 3-man turret. The commander could command, the gunner could aim, and the loader could load. The German tank was a node in a high-speed communications network. The French tank was an isolated, slow-moving strongpoint. The Germans won, not because their tanks were better, but because their system was better. They had built a combined arms orchestra, while the French were still conducting soloists. The French reliance on the Maginot Line was the ultimate symbol of this failed psychology. It represented a nation so traumatized by the losses of World War I that it had turned inward, building a concrete shell in the desperate hope of avoiding another such bloodletting. This Maginot mentality had infected the entire army. It was defensive, reactive, and slow. It prized methodical preparation over speed and rigid plans over improvisation. Blitzkrieg was its perfect psychological antithesis. It was offensive, proactive, and valued improvisation above all else. France's industrial capacity was also not the problem. In 1940, France was producing more and better tanks than Germany, but they were delivering them to units without radios, without proper training, and without a doctrine to use them. The hardware was superior, but the software was fatally outdated. The US military, watching from the sidelines, was horrified and fascinated. The fall of France was the greatest wake-up call in its history. It proved that everything they knew about war was wrong. The age of the infantryman and the battleship was over. The age of the tank and the airplane had begun. The US Army immediately began to form its own armored divisions, directly copying the German Panzer Division model. Men like George S. Patton, who had been preaching armored warfare for years, were suddenly promoted. The lessons from Sedan were being learned in Washington, even as Paris fell. For the British, the psychological shock was just as severe. They had also believed in the French army. Now they were alone, their own army having barely escaped at Dunkirk. The English Channel, which had protected them for centuries, suddenly seemed very narrow. This desperation led directly to the Battle of Britain. The British realized that their only hope was air power. The RAF, unlike the French Armée de l'Air, had a modern integrated system of radar, command, and high-performance fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane. The French Air Force, by contrast, had been destroyed on the ground. Its planes were scattered on unprotected airfields, its command structure was chaotic, and it had no doctrine for supporting a high-speed ground war. It was another victim of the 1918 mindset. The psychological collapse of France also gave birth to its opposite, the resistance. A small handful of men and women, like Charles de Gaulle in London, refused to accept the armistice. They represented a new kind of élan, a belief that France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. This spirit of resistance was born from the trauma of the collapse. It was a psychological refusal to accept the verdict of Blitzkrieg. But for most of the French population in 1940, the dominant feeling was not resistance. It was a stunned, humiliated, and disoriented submission. The world had been turned upside down. The heroes of yesterday, Pétain, were now collaborators. The unknown figures of tomorrow, de Gaulle, were branded as traitors. The invincible army was now a column of prisoners marching to camps in Germany. When German engineers and soldiers examined captured French tanks, they were stunned. The armor on the Char B-1 BIS was so thick their 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate it. They had been forced to use their 80mm anti-aircraft guns in a direct fire role to kill them. They found that the French had superior hardware, but inferior doctrine. This confirmed the Nazi belief in their own spiritual and intellectual superiority. They had won, not with better machines, but with a better will and a more daring idea. This arrogance would lead to their own downfall in Russia. The cockpit of a French bomber or the turret of a Char B-1 tank was a case study in failed psychology. Pilots and commanders were overwhelmed with tasks, lacking the radios and simple ergonomics that would allow them to fight effectively. The technology was there, but the human-centric design was not. The strange defeat was, at its core, a failure of leadership. A generation of generals, traumatized by Verdun, had created an army that was perfect for refighting Verdun. They were psychologically incapable of imagining a war of movement, a war of speed, a war of radio waves. The German Blitzkrieg was not a secret weapon. French officers like Charles de Gaulle had written books in the 1930s arguing for the creation of French armored divisions almost exactly like the Panzers. His ideas were ignored. The High Command was too invested in the Maginot Line. This intellectual arrogance was the true weakness. The French High Command believed they had perfected war. They saw no need to learn from the German invasion of Poland, dismissing it as a fight against an inferior army. They were blinded by their own past victories. The fall of France is therefore a timeless military lesson. It proves that a superior army can be defeated by a superior idea. It proves that doctrinal innovation is more important than concrete fortifications or even the quality of individual tanks. The nation's confidence in its army was not just a mistake, it was a fatal vulnerability. The Germans targeted this psychological center of gravity. Once the belief in invincibility was shattered at Sedan, the entire nation's will to fight collapsed with it. For the German soldiers, the victory was a revelation. They had been nervous about attacking the famed French army. When it dissolved before them, they were filled with a sense of their own invincibility. This victory disease would be their undoing when they invaded the Soviet Union. The story of May 1940 is the story of two mindsets colliding. One was static, defensive, and wedded to the past. The other was dynamic, offensive, and obsessed with the future. The future won. And it won in 6 weeks. When the French High Command finally realized the panzers were in the Ardennes, it was too late. The information did not fit their preconceived plan, so they ignored it. This cognitive dissonance was the true cause of the breach at Sedan. They were defeated before the battle began. The Stuka dive bomber was the perfect psychological weapon against this mindset. It was inaccurate against moving targets, but devastating against static defenses. It was a terror weapon that broke the morale of soldiers who had been trained to hold at all costs, but not trained to be bombed. The French collapse was not just a military failure. It was a moral and intellectual failure. The leaders of the Third Republic had failed to prepare their nation for the reality of modern war. They had sold them a fantasy of an impregnable fortress, a fantasy that burst into flames on the Meuse. The US industrial machine, by comparison, would later build on this lesson. The M4 Sherman, like the T-34, was not the best tank. But it was part of a system of mass production, radio communication, and combined arms doctrine learned directly from the German victory. The French army of 1940 was a hollow shell. It had the outward appearance of power, the tanks, the guns, the numbers, but its core, its doctrine, its command structure, its very soul was still stuck in 1918. Blitzkrieg was the hammer that shattered this illusion. The river of refugees fleeing the panzers was a symbol of this collapse. The army and the people were one, and they were both fleeing. There was no longer a front line and a rear. Blitzkrieg had erased that distinction, turning all of France into a chaotic, panicked battle space. The final analysis from historians was damning. The French did not lose due to a lack of courage or equipment. They lost due to a lack of imagination. Their generals were old men, refighting old battles, psychologically incapable of seeing the new reality speeding towards them. The Blitzkrieg in France is the ultimate lesson in psychological warfare. It proved that a war can be won before the main battle by paralyzing the enemy's decision-making loop. By attacking the mind of the enemy commander, the army itself will collapse. The French generals believed war was a science, a methodical checklist. The Germans, led by men like Rommel, treated it as an art, an improvisational storm of violence and speed. The artists defeated the scientists. The story of the fall of France is a story of how a nation can be defeated by its own history. The victory of 1918 and the trauma of Verdun had blinded France to the future. It had built a perfect defense against the last war, leaving it wide open to the next. The French soldiers who dropped their rifles on the banks of the Meuse were not cowards. They were the victims of a psychological collapse, a shock and awe campaign so total that their entire framework for reality was destroyed. They were men whose minds were broken before their bodies. The invincible army was in fact a brittle facade. Its leaders were arrogant, its doctrine was obsolete, and its mind was closed. It was a giant with feet of clay, and Blitzkrieg was the precisely aimed stone that shattered it. The speed of the collapse was what made it so traumatic. 6 weeks. A nation that had withstood 4 years of brutal warfare in World War I was brought to its knees in less than 2 months. It was a psychological amputation. This fatal trade-off, investing in a static line, Maginot, instead of a dynamic doctrine, armored divisions, was a choice. It was a choice made by a generation of leaders who feared the last war more than they prepared for the next one. The German High Command, by contrast, had embraced innovation. They had read the works of Guderian, Germany, de Gaulle, France, and Liddell Hart, Britain. They were the only ones who had actually listened and built an army based on these new, radical ideas of mechanized warfare. So while the French High Command was looking at railway timetables for infantry, the German High Command was looking at fuel consumption for panzers. This difference in focus, this difference in what they valued, was the entire reason for the victory and the defeat. For the French soldier, the war was a terrifying blur. He was told to march to Belgium, then told to retreat. He saw Stukas in the sky and panzers in his rear. He was given orders that were hours or even days out of date. He was a cog in a machine that had broken. When the war ended, the French were forced into a painful self-reflection. How could this have happened? The strange defeat became a national obsession. The search for traitors, for scapegoats began. But the truth was simpler. The nation had been outthought. The examination of the battlefields confirmed this. Abandoned French tanks, many without fuel or ammunition. Guns left intact, never having fired a shot. The roads littered with the debris of a defeated army that had simply disintegrated under psychological pressure. The Blitzkrieg on France was not just a military victory. It was a psychological masterpiece. It was a campaign designed to create panic, confusion, and despair. It targeted the command structure and the nation's soul as much as it targeted the army. The French belief in their invincibility was the single greatest weapon the Germans had. It made them predictable, arrogant, and slow. The Germans used this psychological vulnerability against them, crafting a plan that was so audacious the French mind simply refused to see it. The lesson from May 1940 was brutal and clear. You must fight the war you are in, not the war you expect. The French expected 1918. They got 1940. The shock of that discovery, compressed into a few days at Sedan, was what broke the will of the nation. The Invincible Army was, in fact, the most vulnerable army in Europe, not because of its equipment but because of its mind. It was a tragedy of arrogance, a psychological collapse that stands as one of the most stunning defeats in history. The confidence of the French people in 1939 was real, but it was based on a false premise. They were not ready. Their army was not ready. It was a magnificent, polished 1918-era relic, and it was about to be destroyed by the future. The soldiers of the French Ninth Army, who broke and ran from the Stukas, were the first to understand the truth. They were not cowards. They were the first human beings to experience the full, terrifying psychological power of Blitzkrieg, and it broke them. The lesson from the Ardennes was simple. No fortress is impassable, no army is invincible, and any doctrine, no matter how successful in the past, will eventually become a liability. The Maginot Line was not a shield. It was a tombstone. The fall of France was not just a defeat. It was a psychological unraveling. A nation's identity was built on the strength of its army, and in 6 weeks that identity was erased. It was a trauma from which France would take decades to recover. The German Blitzkrieg was a weapon that destroyed an army by first destroying its mind. It proved that in modern war, the fastest to observe, decide, and act will win. The French were trapped in a decision loop that was days long. The Germans was mere hours. The strange defeat was the moment the world saw that the future of warfare was not about static lines and artillery barrages. It was about speed, about psychology, and about the terrible, decisive power of the combined arms armored offensive. France was simply its first and most shocking victim,